The night Serena Caldwell walked into the Harborview Grand with another man's name on the guest list, her ex-husband nearly choked on his wine. She didn't plan it that way. She never planned things like that. That had always been the difference between them. Serena Caldwell had spent 11 years being the kind of woman who held things together quietly. She scheduled the dinners nobody remembered to book. She remembered the names of clients' wives, their children, the restaurants they preferred, the allergies they'd mentioned once in passing. She proofread every pitch deck Dominic put his name on. She stayed up past midnight more times than she could count, not because she had to, but because she wanted him to succeed. Because back then his success felt like theirs. She was 32 when Dominic Caldwell told her she was holding him back. He didn't use those exact words. Men like Dominic rarely did. What he said was that they'd grown in different directions, that he needed space to figure out who he was becoming, that the marriage had run its course. He said all of this in the kitchen of the house she'd spent 3 years renovating. The kitchen with the French limestone counters she'd sourced herself, the deep farmhouse sink she'd driven 4 hours to find, the pendant lights she'd rewired twice because the first electrician got the spacing wrong. He said it while standing next to Petra Voss. Serena had not known about Petra Voss until that moment. She found out the way a lot of women find out. All at once, when there's nowhere to sit down. Petra was 26. She worked in communications at Caldwell Group, the consulting firm Dominic had built on the back of a business plan Serena had written the first draft of at their kitchen table in 2013. Petra had straight blonde hair and a very particular kind of confidence that comes from never having had to fight for anything. Dominic filed the papers the following week. Serena moved into a rental apartment in Westmount. It was small and the radiators knocked, and the closets were half the size of what she was used to. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things that year. She was, at the time, 7 months pregnant. She hadn't told anyone, except her sister. She hadn't even been certain she was going to keep the baby. Not because she didn't want it, but because everything had collapsed so fast, and she could barely manage to eat a full meal, let alone imagine raising a child alone. Her obgyn said her blood pressure was climbing. Her sister drove in from Kingston and slept on the pull-out couch for 3 weeks without being asked. Dominic's lawyer sent a note requesting she vacate the property she'd co-signed on within 30 days. He called it the marital home in the letter, as though language might make the whole thing seem orderly. She kept the baby. A girl, born in February, small and furious and pink. She named her Willa. For 2 years, Serena did not think about the future in any ambitious sense. She thought about sleep and feeding schedules, and whether the daycare on Sherbrooke had a spot opening in the fall. She did contract work, brand strategy mostly, for companies that needed someone who could make them sound like they knew what they were doing. She was good at it. She had always been good at making other people's ideas legible. It was a former colleague, a woman named June Hartsfield, who first said to her, "You know you're building somebody else's portfolio, right? You should be doing this for yourself." Serena had laughed it off. Then she went home, put Willa to bed, and didn't sleep for 2 hours because she couldn't stop thinking about it. She started Caldwell & Co., and then immediately renamed it, because she was done carrying his name as a brand. She called it Northmark Strategic. She registered it on a Thursday, told no one for a week, and then quietly began pulling in the clients she'd been servicing for others. It took 14 months before she stopped checking her bank balance every morning, with her stomach clenched. It took 22 months before she stopped measuring herself against where she thought she'd be by now. By the time Willa was 3, Northmark was generating enough revenue that Serena had hired 2 people. By the time Willa was 4, she had a small office on St. Catherine, a team of 5, and a reputation in Montreal's commercial real estate sector that had been earned through nothing more complicated than doing the work well and not overpromising. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a household name. But she was respected, and she had learned, slowly, and sometimes painfully, that respect was actually what she'd been after all along, not the kind that came from being someone's wife. It was in that 4th year that she met Sterling Beauchamp. Sterling was the CFO of a development group called Altitude Properties, one of Northmark's larger accounts. He was methodical, unhurried in his speech, and had a way of listening to people that made them feel their words had somewhere to land. He was also, she would later understand, watching the way she ran her business with something closer to admiration than she'd initially registered. They had worked together for almost 8 months before he asked her to dinner. Not as a client and consultant. As himself and herself. She said yes, then spent the drive home questioning it, then stopped questioning it by the time she got to Willa's school the next morning. She was 38 years old. She was allowed to say yes to things. Their relationship moved at the pace of two people who both had reasons to be careful. Willa met him in the spring. She sized him up with the particular seriousness of a 5-year-old and decided, after he correctly identified her stuffed rabbit's name on the first guess, that he was acceptable. Serena didn't talk about Dominic much with Sterling. It didn't feel necessary. Sterling never pushed. He seemed to understand that some things had to be grown over rather than excavated. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Dominic had been watching, not literally, but in the way that men who once discarded something watch it from a distance once it becomes valuable to someone else. His assistant had mentioned Northmark's name in a meeting. A mutual contact had sent him an article in a Montreal business newsletter. Serena's name had started appearing in places it hadn't before. And Dominic, who had spent 4 years assuming she'd either stumble or quietly disappear, found that assumption dissolving in real time. He had married Petra the previous autumn. The wedding had been at a vineyard in the eastern townships. Serena had found out through Instagram, which she didn't use anymore, because a friend had screenshot it and sent it with a string of fire emojis and then immediately apologized. Petra was now pregnant. The irony of it sat in Serena's chest like a stone she had eventually learned to stop picking up. The dinner at Harborview Grand was a private event. Altitude Properties had reserved the South Room for a client appreciation evening. Sterling had asked Serena to join him, not as a vendor but as his partner. She'd worn a deep green dress she'd bought 2 years ago and never found occasion for. Willa had declared it, the fancy one with great ceremony, before Serena's sister swept her off for a sleepover. Serena had been standing near the bar, one hand around a glass of sparkling water when she heard the voice. Not Dominic's. The mate, D. Caldwell, your table is just this way. She didn't turn immediately. She made herself stand still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned. Dominic was already looking at her. He'd come in from the far entrance with Petra beside him. Petra, visibly pregnant now, in a cream dress with long sleeves. And for a moment, just a moment, Dominic's face did something involuntary. Something that flickered through his composure like a power surge before he managed to shut it off. He looked at the room around her. He looked at Sterling, who had just appeared at Serena's side with 2 drinks, who placed a hand briefly at the small of her back with the ease of someone who had done it before. He looked at the way the room seemed to tilt slightly around Serena. The fact that people were stopping to greet her, that a man in the corner, a developer, Serena recognized as one of the city's most particular clients, was already nodding in her direction. Dominic looked like a man who had just realized he'd sold a stock the morning before it tripled. Sterling noticed the shift in Serena's posture before she said anything. He leaned slightly toward her. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. And the strange thing was, she meant it. She didn't approach Dominic. She didn't avoid him either. When the room naturally placed them at adjacent tables for the pre-dinner reception, she greeted him with the specific pleasantness of a woman who has long since outgrown the version of herself that needed him to feel bad. Petra smiled at her with the uncertainty of someone who knows the history but not the shape of it. "Serena," Dominic said. His voice was calibrated, careful. She recognized the calculation behind it. He was deciding in real time what posture to take. "Dominic," she said. "Congratulations on the baby." She meant it as a statement, not a wound. He seemed to receive it as both. Sterling extended a hand. Sterling Beauchamp. "I'm with Altitude Properties," he said it simply. But Serena knew he was aware, as she was, that Altitude Properties was considerably larger than Caldwell Group's current footprint in the Montreal market. There was a conversation. It lasted perhaps 6 minutes. Dominic asked how business was going, which was the question of a man who already knew the answer and needed to hear it confirmed aloud. Serena told him it was going well. Sterling said something understated about Northmark's most recent project, a mixed-use development in Griffintown that had been quietly generating significant attention. Dominic nodded. He did something with his jaw that meant he was recalculating. "You're doing well for yourself," he said to Serena, at a moment when Sterling had stepped away to greet someone. "I'm doing well," she said. She didn't add, "for myself." She didn't add anything at all. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard Northmark's pitching the Riverside contract." She smiled. "I can't discuss active pitches." He laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that sits slightly too high in the throat. "Right. Of course." A pause. "I hope you know there are no hard feelings." "On my end." Serena looked at him. She looked at him the way she hadn't permitted herself to look at him in 4 years. Clearly, without anger, without longing, without anything except an honest and unbothered appraisal. "Dominic," she said, "I have a 5-year-old daughter, a company I built, and a life I actually want. Hard feelings require a lot of energy I can't afford to spend." She tilted her head slightly. "But thank you." He didn't have an answer for that. Sterling came back. Someone called Dominic's name from across the room. Petra touched his arm. The moment dissolved. But the thing about moments like that is they have a way of rippling outward in directions you don't see coming. What Serena didn't know, not yet, was what Petra Voss had done. She found out in pieces the way these things usually unfold. The Riverside contract was one of the largest commercial development projects in the city's recent history. A mixed-use waterfront overhaul that had been in planning for years and was finally moving to the proposal stage. Northmark had been preparing their pitch for 6 weeks. It was meticulous. It was Serena's best work, and more importantly, it was the work of her whole team. They had poured themselves into it. 2 days after the Harborview dinner, she got a call from the project lead. There was an issue, he said. Something had been flagged about the Northmark proposal. A conflict of interest had been raised, anonymously, suggesting that Serena's relationship with Altitude Properties constituted a problematic overlap with one of the development consortium's funding partners. It was, Serena recognized immediately, completely fabricated. Altitude was not a funding partner. They were an independent client. There was no overlap that had not already been properly disclosed. But it had the effect of temporarily putting the proposal on hold. Her lawyer, a woman named Francine Osibonsu, who had a perfectly expressionless face and a reputation for patience that bordered on geological, advised her not to react publicly. "Someone filed this knowing it wouldn't hold," Francine said. "They filed it to slow you down. The question is whether they have anything else." Serena thought about the Harborview dinner. She thought about the way Dominic had asked about Riverside. She thought about how Caldwell Group had, according to a mutual contact, been struggling to find footing in the current market. "I think I know who," Serena said. "Don't speculate out loud," Francine told her. The person who confirmed it was not who she expected. It was Petra, not directly, not in a confession. What happened was more complicated than that. Petra Voss had, at some point in the months prior, begun confiding in a woman named Alana Gregg, a former colleague from her communications days who had since moved to a boutique PR firm. Alana and Serena had crossed paths twice, briefly in professional settings. They were not friends, but they had enough of a mutual network that when Alana heard what was happening, she made a phone call. She told Serena, plainly and without embellishment. Petra had been the one to make the anonymous complaint. She had gotten the information about the Riverside pitch from Dominic's desk. Notes he'd made after the dinner, piecing together what he'd heard and inferred. She had drafted the complaint herself. Dominic had known and had not stopped her. "Why are you telling me this?" Serena asked. "Because I have 2 daughters," Alana said. "And because I watched what you built, and I don't think people should be allowed to knock other people's things over just because it makes them feel better." Serena sat with this for a long time after she hung up. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired, and then she felt something under the tiredness that was harder to name. A kind of clarity, maybe. The recognition that this was not a surprise. That she had always known, somewhere in the part of herself she'd kept quiet, that Dominic was capable of this. That she had spent years making herself smaller to avoid becoming inconvenient to him. And that she was done. Francine filed a formal counter-disclosure with the consortium, detailing the grounds on which the initial complaint had been submitted, and the absence of any legitimate basis. She did this with a level of calm specificity that Serena found almost beautiful. The consortium reviewed it within 48 hours. They reinstated Northmark's proposal to active consideration. 3 weeks later, Serena got the call. She was at her desk when it came. Not at home, not in some cinematic setting, just at her desk at 4 in the afternoon with a cold coffee and a spreadsheet open, and Willa's school photo tacked to the corkboard to her left. The project lead told her that the consortium had selected Northmark Strategic as their lead planning and strategy partner for the Riverside development. She thanked him, made notes, confirmed next steps. She hung up. Then she put her forehead down on her desk for about 30 seconds and breathed. Then she picked up her phone and called Sterling. "We got it," she said. There was a pause. Then, "Of course you did," she laughed. It came out slightly strange, like something that had been held too long finally getting air. The fallout for Caldwell Group came in the weeks that followed, and it came not from Serena but from the disclosure Francine had filed. It was a matter of record now. The complaint, the timeline, the fact that someone had attempted to interfere with a procurement process using falsified grounds. The consortium shared the documentation with their legal team, and from there it moved through channels in the way these things do. Dominic hired a lawyer. There were meetings Serena was not part of. Caldwell Group's relationship with 2 of the consortium's partner firms quietly ended. The developer who had nodded at Serena across the room at Harborview, a man named François Renaud, who had been watching the whole situation with the detached interest of someone who made it his business to know where the talent was, made a call to Northmark's office the following month. He wanted to talk about a project, a bigger one. Serena took the meeting. What she did not do, what she was careful not to do, was speak about Dominic publicly. She did not give interviews about what had happened. She did not post anything. She answered questions from the consortium's legal team with the measured accuracy her lawyer advised, and beyond that, she let the record speak. Petra Voss resigned from her communications position quietly, before anything required her to leave. Serena found out from Alana, in a brief text that said simply, "She's gone." She didn't respond to it. There was nothing to say. There was no version of that ending that felt like winning, not in any way she wanted to claim. What she told her sister, late one night after Willa was asleep, when her sister asked how she felt about all of it. Serena thought for a moment and then said, "Like I wasted a lot of years waiting for something to be different than it was, and like I'm not going to waste any more." Her sister had said that sounded like something worth keeping. It was Sterling who noticed it first, the way Serena had changed in those months. Not dramatically, she hadn't become a different person, but something in her had settled. Some long-held tension in the way she held herself had gone quiet. "You seem lighter," he said once, in the particular low-key way he had of naming things. She thought about that. "I think I stopped carrying something," she said. She didn't explain further. He didn't ask her to. The Riverside project began in earnest the following spring. Serena's team grew to 11 people. She hired a project manager she'd been trying to recruit for 2 years. She took on an operations director who had been running a much larger firm and had, inexplicably, decided that she wanted to build something, rather than manage something established. Willa started kindergarten. She pronounced the word kindergarten with specific authority and corrected anyone who abbreviated it. On the morning of the Riverside groundbreaking, a gray October morning with the river flat and cold behind the ceremonial site, Serena stood in the crowd with a hard hat she'd been handed by a site coordinator and thought about the kitchen with the French limestone counters. She thought about the radiators in the Westmount apartment that used to knock. She thought about the first time she'd registered Northmark's name in the Quebec Business Registry, sitting in her kitchen at 11 at night while Willa slept in the next room, and how she'd closed the laptop and sat for a minute in the dark, because she was too tired to feel anything except a small, stubborn sense that this was the right thing to do. She hadn't known then where it would go. You don't, usually. You just do the next thing, and the thing after that, and you try not to let what was taken from you convince you to take less than you're worth. A photographer from a business magazine was there that morning. He took a picture of Serena standing at the site, hard hat tilted slightly, looking at something off to the left. The river, probably, or the skyline, or nothing in particular. She didn't know it existed until the magazine ran it the following week, in a spread about Northmark and the project. Her mother called to say she'd seen it. Her mother said, "You look like yourself." Serena hadn't known what to say to that, so she'd said, "I know," which wasn't quite right, but was close enough. Willa saw the magazine at her grandmother's house and declared that her mother was famous. Serena corrected her. Willa was unimpressed by the correction. She did not hear from Dominic again. Not directly. She understood, through the ambient noise of shared professional circles, that Caldwell Group had restructured, that he and Petra had moved to Toronto, that the baby had been born. A boy, she'd heard, healthy. She received this information and set it down without turning it over. She had, somewhere in the 4 years since that morning in the limestone-countered kitchen, stopped needing his story to intersect with hers. That was the thing about becoming your own center of gravity. Eventually, the orbit changes. The last time Sterling stayed for dinner on a Tuesday. Not an occasion, just a Tuesday. With Willa at the table eating pasta and explaining something at length about a disagreement she'd had at school, involving a crayon that was, apparently, definitely hers. Serena looked around the table and thought, this is what I was building toward, even when I didn't know what it looked like. Not revenge, not vindication, not the moment when someone who had underestimated her finally saw how wrong they'd been. Just this. Just her daughter's voice filling the kitchen, and a man across the table who had chosen to be here, and outside the window the city going about its evening, and Serena Caldwell, 39 years old, no longer waiting for anything to begin.